Welcome back, class. We are now in Chapter 20 of our discussion of Volume 2 of the American Yawp, our History 1302 course. And this chapter is titled The Progressive Era, and it represents sort of a turning point in the way the government and the individuals, citizens of the country start to interact as we move into the late 19th into the early 20th century. So this chapter is going to highlight the widespread reform movements that emerges in the United States between about 1890 to about 1920, and it's going to aim to address the social, political, and economic issues that will arise during that Gilded Age period. So let's jump right in. The Progressive Era arose as a response to the rapid industrialization of the 19th century, the late 19th century, and many Americans become increasingly concerned about stark inequalities, corruption, and social injustices that are accompanying these changes. There's many issues that need to be dealt with, and each individual sort of takes their own sort of focus and works to facilitate change within that focus. Now, activists and intellectuals, often referred to as progressives, are going to seek to address these problems through reform and reform movements. And they'll utilize journalism, especially investigative journalism known as muckraking, to expose the ills of society, like child labor would be an example, poor working conditions, political corruption, alcoholism, racial injustice. All these things are going to play a role here. Now, journalists like Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell are going to play critical roles in raising public awareness and igniting calls for change. And hopefully in our conversation we'll get back to those individuals a little bit more in depth. Now, political reform is a significant focus of the progressive movement. Activists sought to eliminate corruption in politics and also to increase democratic participation. And this period saw the introduction of key reforms, like the introduction of the secret ballot in elections, direct primaries to give you and I a say in who is going to be the candidate for a particular political party. Initiative, which allows us to introduce legislation, referendums, which allow us to vote on legislation, and all of this is going to empower voters, and it reduces the influence of political machines, which we've talked about before. We're also going to start to see other reforms like the introduction of the 16th Amendment, which that's the progressive income tax, where the more you make, the more you pay, and it's not just on a everybody pays 5%. If I make $1,000, 5% is much less than 5% of $1 million. No, it's the more you make, the larger the percentage that you pay. So that's what we call the graduated or the progressive income tax. And the 17th Amendment, which is going to introduce a direct election of U.S. senators. Prior to this, and throughout the rest of U.S. history prior, your senators were selected by state legislatures. Now it's going to be a big popularity contest, just like the House of Representatives. Now, one of the most monumental achievements of the progressive era, this is going to be the fight for women's suffrage. Activists like Susan B. Anthony and then later Alice Paul are going to mobilize millions of women to demand the right to vote. And this culminates in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, and this will grant women the right to vote across the United States. Some states had given women the right to vote in certain elections, and some states not. The first state to give women the right to vote was Wyoming in 1869. It was a means by which to increase the female population in that state early on, or at least in that territory, to allow it to become a state. But with the 19th Amendment, it becomes the law of the land across the entire United States. Women now have the right to vote. And this is a fight that began with the Seneca Falls Convention back in 1848. Now, economic reform, this is another cornerstone of the progressive movement. Workers face long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions. And these conditions in factories and mines oftentimes proved fatal. Or it would leave you maimed. Sometimes you could often tell a person's job by the nature of their disabilities. Were they missing fingers to have a hand gone? Were they coughing all the time because of coal dust, and they had black lung and this sort of thing? And the rise of labor unions, of course, the American Federation of Labor, which I believe we've already discussed, helped to organize workers and their advocate for their rights as well. Now, one of the events that's really going to start to shape the way that government, particularly local governments, begin to regulate their municipalities, their cities, building codes and stuff, it's going to be the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This is in New York. It's one of the newest buildings in the city, and it was claimed to have been a fireproof building. And that's not 100% incorrect. The building itself was fireproof. What's inside, however, is still flammable. And what happened in 1919 was a number of women were working at a shirt factory, a blouse factory, and a fire broke out. They can't get out of the building. Many of the doors were blocked off to keep women from, they wanted to check to make sure that women were not stealing fabric and taking home. And I think it was something like 400 people died. It was one of the worst workplace disasters in that city's history, and we won't see anything really worse until 9/11. Now, this disaster is going to prompt reforms at the state and national level, and this leads us to improved labor laws. This includes child labor restrictions and safety standards as well. Now, the Progressive Era also sees a rise in social reform movements aimed at improving living conditions for the urban poor. Settlement houses like Jane Addams' Hull House will provide education, health care, and social services to immigrant families, and this is going to help to integrate them into American society. And again, we've talked about many of these things before. These chapters overlap, and we could probably have combined this into one great big Gilded Age conversation. But this allows me to keep it with the chapters. Women are going to play a pivotal role in these social reforms, these societal reforms, leading to movements for like temperance. That's going to be an attempt to either abolish or temper the use of alcohol, and also child labor, child welfare. The temperance movement, which sought to limit alcohol consumption, ultimately leads to the enactment of prohibition with the 19th Amendment in 1920. And this was an effort to improve society, but it also gave rise to illegal activities, the emergence of organized crime, and the 18th Amendment becomes the only amendment in American history that is actually amended out of the Constitution. The 21st Amendment says, all right, we're done with this, we can't enforce it, and by the middle of the Great Depression, Americans just want to drink. So, moving on a bit more. While progressive reform or the progressive movement sought to address many social injustices, it often fell short on some of these issues. While there are those that fought for example, African American rights and civil rights, you've got other. The fact is, this is a movement that just simply is not focusing on one or two things. It's spread too thin. African Americans are going to face systemic discrimination, segregation, and violence. Particularly in Jim Crow South, but also in many northern states as well. You've got it just looks different, but it's happening all over. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells are going to advocate for civil rights, social justice, and many of them calling for an end to lynching and disenfranchisement. What is disenfranchisement? That means barriers to the vote. Now, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, will be founded in 1909 out of an earlier movement called the Niagara Movement. And this is to fight for the rights of African Americans. Now, although the progressive movement made significant strides in many areas, racial equality remained one that would be unresolved. It would remain an unresolved issue. And this sets the stage for, of course, future civil rights struggles. And in the 1940s, and then certainly into the 50s with Martin Luther King Jr. and into the 60s, we're going to see this movement continue until ultimately we get some semblance of equality and equal treatment coming out of the latter 20th century. Now, in summary, Chapter 20 explores the Progressive Era, and this is a time of significant reform aimed at addressing social, political, and economic challenges of the early 20th century. And from the fight to women's suffrage, labor rights as well, we're trying to improve living conditions in urban settings. Progressives sought to create a more equitable and just society. Now, and they thought that government was the way to do that. Now, however, the era also highlights the ongoing struggles for racial equality. There are several other areas that just simply does not get addressed as much as folks would hope that they would be. But that is sort of the Progressive Era in a nutshell. So thanks for joining me in this review of Chapter 20. And again, if you find it helpful, let me know. If you want to put a comment down below it, I will try to get back with you when I can. But otherwise, hope this helps as you prepare for your test. Good luck on those exams, because I know many of you have midterms coming up, and you guys take care, and I'll see you down the road.